I'm Sally Ann Watts, and welcome to CEDA's 2020 US election panel discussion. And I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. To start with, in conjunction with CEDA, I'd like to acknowledge that today and every day we are on Aboriginal land. And committed to reconciliation and recognition, we respect elders and we support their stated aspirations. As you all know, earlier this week the US held its presidential elections, and today's panel has three great speakers who will give us their thoughts on what either outcome might mean for America domestically, for the world, and importantly for Australia, and how Australia's national interests might be impacted. We will learn what a changing America means for us, our region, our security, and our economy. This will be followed by a discussion, and today, as at all CEDA public events, you will be able to engage with our panellists through the Q&A portal, which is available via the link below the video on your screen. Or you can ask your questions by going to ceda.pigeonhole.at and using the passcode US election, one word. You can also join the conversation on Twitter by using today's hashtag, which is hashtag US election 2020, one word if that's possible, and tagging CEDA at CEDA_news. And to introduce myself, I'm Sally Ann Watts. I'm the Deputy CEO at the Australian Trade and Investment Commission. And as our name suggests, we are responsible for facilitating trade and investment between Australia and the rest of the world. We have had a team in the US, across the US, for over 60 years now, talking to business, supporting Australian business, and pursuing our commercial interests between both countries. The US is both our number one foreign investor in Australia, and it's also the number one destination for Australian investment overseas. And there's a combined value of $1.47 trillion in 2019, almost as large as Australia's gross domestic product. And it's also, the US is also one of our largest export destinations, and there are over 11,000 Australian exporters selling into America, both goods and services, every year. So we therefore watch with keen interest what happens in America, and we too are eager to hear today what the election might mean for all of us. Australia's relationship with the US cuts across so many dimensions, of which trade and investment is but one, and I'm sure that will become evident through today's discussion. So knowing that our time today is limited, I'd like to now introduce our expert panel, who are Professor Simon Jackman, who's the CEO of the United States Study Centre, Paul Gruenwald, who's the Global Chief Economist with Standard & Poor's Global Ratings, coming to us from New York, and Penny Burtt, who's the Group CEO for Asialink. The format today is that our speakers will each make opening comments, and then we will move to a moderated discussion. So now, without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our first speaker. So please welcome Professor Simon Jackman for his opening address.
Thanks, Sally, and thanks for all the great work you and your colleagues at Austrade do, and the US Study Centre, of course. Part of our ambit is indeed Australia's deep trade investment, in particular the investment relationship with the US, something that I think doesn't get sufficient credit in popular conversations about Australia's relationship with the US, often framed through a security or the alliance frame, but as I like to say, the US-Australia relationship is literally being transacted hour by hour out of the Sydney and Melbourne CBDs as much as it is through the more heavyweight boilerplate government-to-government things. I want to begin with a brief rip from the headlines take on just where we are with the election before we talk about what might come from it. it ain't over. But I think it's very close to being over. Right now, Donald Trump will have to essentially win all the states that aren't called at this point: Pennsylvania, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Arizona. And some networks have called Arizona. I think it's highly likely that Biden will win Nevada, as did Obama, and we're starting to run out of options for Donald Trump if that last dribble of absentee vote trends the way it has been. And in Pennsylvania and Georgia, it's been overwhelmingly Democratic and could narrowly pull those states over the line and hand Biden a win. Biden doesn't need that, by the way. If the vote counting stopped right this instant, Biden would win narrowly, 270 to 268 in the Electoral College. So I think it's more likely than not, far more likely than not, that Biden becomes president. Legal challenges aren't out of the realm of possibility, and particularly even sort of the typically standard thing of a close result entitling both sides, or either side, to the losing side is the one typically asking for it, a recount, that is. Just to inform Australian listeners, in the age of machine counting of ballots, the recent experience in the United States is that recounts change very little. The thing that does change things is if you find some votes somewhere that should have been in but weren't. But machine counting, the same votes that have just been machine counted, changes things, down at the hundredths of a percentage point sort of territory. So recount, per se, I don't think is sort of a route for Trump to think he might pull states that, he ends up losing a state by 15, 20,000 votes, say. A recount per se won't do it for him. He will need challenges to the validity of the mail ballots. And right now, and again, it's difficult for me to assess from this distance, but everything we're seeing suggests so far, this is absolutely bog standard garden variety absentee vote counting. It's very hard to look at what's been happening and say there are some suspicious ballots in the mix. They counted right now, Pennsylvania was already extensively litigated on this question. Trump's protestations about votes being admitted to the count can be received by election officials 3 days after the close of voting. That was already litigated. That was already appealed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court refused to overturn the decision of the Pennsylvania court. So there's not a lot of promising signs thus far in the legal options that Trump, as recently as 20 minutes ago, was talking about bringing a, quote, a lot of litigation. So let's proceed from the basis, therefore, that Biden will have a very narrow win. A couple of observations. That will mark now, I think, 7 out of 8 presidential elections where the Democratic candidate has won more votes than the Republican in presidential elections. The last time a Republican presidential candidate outpolled a Democratic presidential candidate was 2004 when George W. Bush in his re-election bid outpolled John Kerry. But before that, you've got to go back to George Bush Sr. Defeating Michael Dukakis in 1988 to find a time. So it's not a it says something about where the country is nationally, but of course the United States with its political institutions, all sorts of ways that hand power to the minority. In this case, the minorities are the Republicans, are the minority I'm talking to in particular here. The mechanism of the Electoral College, with a small state bias hardwired into it, a form of constitutionally mandated malapportionment, if you will. Right now, Republicans, the Democratic vote is overwhelmingly concentrated in big states. Winning California 70-30 is a massive, if you will, from a technical political point, wasted vote. You would really like to be able to pick up 4 million excess votes in California and sprinkle them through the rest of the country if you're a Democratic strategist. And similarly, the United States Senate, with the guarantee of 2 senators per state, irrespective of population size, means that nationwide, Democrats can win votes for the US Senate by overwhelming margins, but still the United States Senate remains, and indeed remains after this election, in Republican hands. So President Biden will have a narrow win, presumably, but inherit a Senate that remains in Republican control. And that's going to have some policy implications that I'll talk about really briefly. Any aspirations, I think, that Biden had for a massive spend on infrastructure, 1.7 trillion US dollars over 10 years was being talked about in the campaign. I think that's not going to happen until the composition of the Senate changes. Small initiatives may be possible by attaching them to budget legislation and brokering some sort of compromise with the Republican Senate. I wouldn't put a lot of hope in that on issues like climate change. More likely might be infrastructure spending, something that both sides of politics sort of like. They might be able to do something on that. And I think that's significant for Australian commercial interests, particularly our super funds and institutional investors who look at US infrastructure plays as things they'd like more exposure to if they could get it. And something that they thought the Trump administration would deliver on. And Joe Hockey was constantly talking up a big game for Australian interest in more infrastructure spending and having an investment role in those. That may actually come to pass, might be the one thing I'd point to. Other initiatives by Biden are much more likely to be through the regulatory route, where, again, the challenge he will face there is the fact that, particularly on environmental regulation, is that so many of the American courts now, the federal courts, are populated by Trump appointees. Trump appointed more judges to the federal bench than any US president in recent history. When he came to power, Trump had about 20% of the federal bench vacant, and he moved with great dispatch through his first term to take that, to fill that up with young voters. I will go to my grave with Trump appointees on the federal bench. And that is, you want to talk about Trump legacy should he lose this election, that's one of them right there. The transformation in the short term to medium term of the federal judiciary in the United States, who will be hostile to reimposition of some of the regulations that Trump very assiduously undid over his first term. Finally, and other speakers are going to get to this, so I won't say too much about foreign policy and trade, other than the signal that, look, all the signals from Biden is a return to less skepticism or less reflexive hostility towards multilateralism. One of the things I used to say about, and I still say about the Trump White House, is that there's only one thing they're more hostile about than China, and that's multilateralism. And I think we can expect that potentially to change, perhaps most notably in putting the United States back into Paris, probably on day one of the administration. That has some interesting implications for Australia that we can talk through as well, potentially. The United States potentially quite rapidly goes from having an administration that's kind of supportive and on its right flank, if anything, with respect to international climate agreements and the way they bind or don't bind domestic policy settings, to an American administration, at least, in the executive branch that is on the other side of them now, has gone back into Paris, is openly talking about targets. And that's a place where Australian governments have not gone. I think the international pressure that just comes by virtue of our largest strategic partner in the United States, perhaps going down that road, can't help but have domestic implications here. And last word, which is actually always the first word in government-to-government conversations between Australia and the United States at the moment, is China. One of the other legacies of the Trump administration will be a cementing of the change in the American strategic mindset about China. It was Trump canonical statements of foreign policy doctrine and strategic thinking, the national defense strategy, the national security strategy, that heralded we are now in an age of great power rivalry and strategic competition. Counterinsurgency and counterterrorism were no longer the primary foreign policy security challenges faced by the United States. Instead, a multidimensional, multi-domain challenge from China in particular for technological, economic, ideational primacy over the balance of the 21st century is what the game is about. That has been embraced across both sides of the aisle in Washington. Biden's foreign policy team have that as a founding axiomatic starting point. They bring that sensibility to office. What will change between the Trump administration is the policy modus operandi for that. The way that finds policy footing will differ markedly. I think the tariffs on China stay in place for the short term. I think Democrats grudgingly concede that that has rattled China's cage and is a point of leverage that they perhaps won't be in a big hurry to give up. And moreover, will be distracted by the immense policy challenges on the domestic front before I think they turn to China, where I think bedding down a more comprehensive take towards China is sort of the first order of business. Biden wants China's participation on climate change. Alliances have to be a big part, a more explicit part of any strategy in the end. I think that's going to take a little while to bed down, as it does in the ordinary course of any American transition, just getting the people in place, particularly with a Senate that's not going to be utterly cooperative with respect to your appointments. But there's a little bit of sort of reading the tea leaves on China policy, and I won't go into the details beyond that. I know other speakers may have views on that, but that's 10 or 11 minutes from me to get us started. Thanks.
Okay, well, hi, everyone. This is Paul Gruenwald. I'm coming to you from Lower Manhattan in New York City. I'm coming to you from yesterday. So it's great to be here. Thanks very much to CEDA for inviting me. Usually I'd be there in person on my 1 or 2 swings through Australia, but obviously that's not happening. We'll have to do this virtually. So I've got the economic remit today. So I'll take you through S&P Global's latest economic thinking, where the forecast is, where the risks are, how the U.S. feeds into that. And then I'll go probably to Australia, both directly and through China. Simon just laid out, I think, pretty well what some of the issues are there. But let me set the economic backdrop. This is still all getting driven by COVID, not too surprisingly. We had record declines in economic activity in the second quarter of the year for most countries. China was a quarter ahead of us. They had the big drop in Q1. But we're heading for a 4% contraction in global GDP in 2020. We haven't seen a number like that since the Great Depression about, what is that, almost 85, 90 years ago. And then the growth numbers themselves are just off the scale. We had annualized declines of 30, 40, 50% in some countries in Q2. We'll see similar numbers and are seeing similar numbers on the upside in Q3. So what we're advising our clients and what we're sort of thinking through ourselves is to just stop thinking about growth rates for the next year or so. They're too confusing. Let's look at the level of activity. Where are we relative to the end of 2019, where all of this started? And almost every country in the world is below where they started the year, even with some of these spectacular rebounds. But we are rebounding. We had a good quarter in Q3. We're losing some momentum in Q4. But I think the way that different regions have bounced back is important. It's also important for Australia, given that China is your major trading partner. If you think about what's been driving the rebound here in the US and also in Europe, it's been the household sector. Consumers are starting to spend mainly on autos and consumer goods, not too much on services. We're still not going to restaurants and bars and theaters and flying around as we were before the pandemic. But we do have a consumer-driven bounce in the U.S. and Europe, partly in response to the big government stimulus plans. But in Asia, that's different. If you look at the way China's rebounding, it's led, not too surprisingly, by the government. So it's, the old playbook of state banks lending to state enterprises, driving the 5-year plan. It's very infrastructure heavy. It's very commodity heavy, which is benefiting Australia's mineral exports. But as I said, we're slowing into the fourth quarter. And one of the things that's worrying us is that although we're a bit ahead of schedule on the growth forecast in Q3, because of the recent resurgence in COVID and because of the new lockdowns in Europe and to a lesser extent here in the US, we're going to be limping into 2021. Our global growth forecast, which I just shared with you, of -4 this year is still good, but the risk is that that kind of spills over into 2021 and we end up having a longer and more protracted recovery. This is going to be a long recovery. Just to give you some benchmarks, the one question we get is, When will we return to the end 2019 level of activity? That's going to be the end of next year for the US and Europe. China might get there a little bit earlier. Emerging markets will get there a bit later. So it's going to take a year or more just to get back to the starting point in terms of the level of GDP. If we're looking at labor market outcomes, then we're even weaker. It's going to take maybe 3 or 4 years to get back to where we were. Unemployment rates of kind of 3.5 in the US and, not too much higher than that in Australia. Policy has been very important to combat the effects of the crisis. This is not an economic crisis. We don't have a playbook for pandemics. The last pandemic we saw was 100 years ago, and modern economics wasn't invented then. We didn't have the GDP accounts and everything else. So we figured out how it works. But one thing that's really important is fiscal policy. And one thing we've discovered is that maybe we have a bit more fiscal space than we thought. There was a lot of worrying before the COVID crisis that debt levels were high and fiscal space was somehow limited. Debt levels were high, but as it turns out, governments have the scope to respond, at least in the advanced countries. The IMF's done some nice work on fiscal space, and it's basically correlated with per capita income. The European countries, and I would throw Australia and New Zealand into that bucket, do have fixed fiscal space to expand spending to combat the downside of the pandemic and to build a bridge to the recovery. Some of the emerging markets have less fiscal space, but the challenge here is to kind of offset the drop in private demand with public demand and then ease back as we move into the recovery. That's sort of the cushioning part. And then the part that's going to be a little bit tricky is we want to protect workers. We want to protect small and vulnerable firms, but the economy is going to have to adjust to the COVID shock. We know already there's going to be structural changes. When this is all said and done, we're going to have more spending on health, more spending on tech, more spending on online, and then we're going to have less spending on commercial real estate, less spending on malls and shopping. Airlines and other things will be kind of a wash. We'll have to figure that out. But the economy is going to have to adjust. So the fiscal trick is to make sure, again, we cushion the downturn, but we don't lock firms and workers into their current sectors because we're going to have to, change the economy around as we exit this crisis. And then briefly on monetary policy, I think we all know the playbook by now. Central banks in the advanced countries have taken policy rates down to zero. The RBA and the RBNZ were spared that during the global financial crisis, but as we know, both of those central banks are essentially now at the zero lower bound. Yesterday or the day before, the RBA announced that they're going to be launching quantitative easing, another 100 billion out on the yield curve, buying 5 to 10-year government bonds. So that ultra easy stance of monetary policy with zero rates, quantitative easing, some form of yield curve control, some sort of strategic intervention into commercial paper markets, money markets, swap markets, etc. We think that's going to be the playbook for central banks until we actually get a robust recovery. We know from the Fed here in the U.S. and from the ECB, Christine Lagarde, that the central banks are not going to start to raise rates until they see the whites of the eyes of inflation. They're not going to do it preemptively as they have done in the past. Let me wrap up just by talking a bit about Australia and where we see the Australian economy. A lot of this is externally driven in terms of the growth delta. Australia's mining exports, as I said, have held up. You guys know really well. That's been as a result of China's stimulus and infrastructure push. But as we've seen globally, services exports, services production in general has been quite weak. That includes education and in tourism. We've seen the Australian government pick up spending. We've seen the Australian Central Bank, the RBA, take rates down to zero. So our read is that the policy is working, but again, we've got this slowing of growth into the fourth quarter, which we continue to see as a risk. Maybe just a couple of things to pick up on what Simon was talking about on the election. Simon, you did a good job of characterizing where we are. I was watching the news right before I jumped here into my back office to take this call. But we talk a lot with the Chamber of Commerce and the Business Roundtable and the Chamber of Commerce and the U.S.-China Business Council. these big guys, they know how to work through the politics. So it's not as if having Biden versus Trump is going to be a tectonic change in the way U.S. multinationals do business with Australia or with China. They're going to continue to, to do their thing and to serve their shareholders and more broadly their stakeholders. So I'm not sure we'll see a big change. I do agree with Simon's view that my reading, at least, of a potential Biden administration is they will be more multilateral. They will be more collaborative. They may not necessarily be easier. I spent about 20 years in Asia. I just moved back to the U.S. last year, but one of the surprises for me was every China conference now has a national security panel, and everyone across the board sees China as a strategic rival or a strategic competitor rather than, Chimerica, let's build out the supply chains and, make everyone happy. So I think that reading of the relationship is not going to change. There's going to be a focus on tech security, on data security, health supply lines and supply chain securities coming out of COVID. So those things are on the table. I think the issue is, will it be confined to that narrow group as well as, let's say, reciprocity of investment, or will it be a kind of an escalation and a broadening of the tension of the relationship? My humble opinion is this is the most important bilateral relationship of the century, so it's definitely something to watch. But we'll have more clarity hopefully tomorrow or the day after who won our presidential election, so we can say something more definitive. But let me wrap it up there and turn it over to Penny Burtt. Penny.
Cool. Thank you very much, Paul. And what fantastic presentations. I'm going to try and keep this very short because I think we've actually surfaced already many of the key issues for our discussion. But I just wanted to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from where I'm joining you today and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So in a very short time to address a very complex topic, I really wanted to go a little bit further on the question of what the outcome of the elections could mean for Australia's foreign policy, and specifically for our interests in the Indo-Pacific. Both Simon and Paul have already touched on some of those. But I think at the outset, it's actually quite important to note that foreign policy and international relations have actually featured very little during the campaign, with the notable exception really of China and, of course, climate change. And as the two previous speakers have noted, the raft of domestic issues and challenges is so significant for the US that the administration has got a lot of domestic fixing to do before it actually turns to any significant sort of pivots on the foreign policy front. That said, I actually want to make sort of three key points about what this could mean for Australia, and not surprisingly, those are that we're coming from a very difficult position, that the China relationship, as Paul has just put it beautifully, is going to be the defining relationship. So getting the US-China relationship somewhere different potentially is going to have huge bearing on how Australia's interests play out in the region. And lastly, the point around multilateralism and what that means for Australia as a middle power, and particularly on the environment front. So I know it sounds a little bit obvious, but the outcome of the US elections notwithstanding, the outlook for the Indo-Pacific remains uncertain and volatile at best. The broad shift in economic power from east to west is going to continue. China's going to continue to grow in influence and be more assertive, nationalistic, ideological. And then in the past, we've got the same regional flashpoints in terms of security from Taiwan to the South China Sea. And quite frankly, the full implications of the COVID crisis for the regional economy have yet to play out, as Paul's just pointed out. So, the environment in that way remains tough. Secondly, over the period of the Trump administration, we've seen the US as Australia's key ally far less attentive to the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific, whichever you prefer, which is our sphere of primary interest. And there are many ways in which the US has been less attentive, but really not showing up in the region, whether that's for bilateral visits or in regional summits at leader level, withdrawing from key regional trade agreements, not stepping into new regional trade agreements, such as the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and to put it very directly, not showing up at the right time during the COVID crisis. In essence, that means US influence has declined while China's influence and assertiveness has grown. And I think it'd be interesting, just for me to mention as an aside, a recent discussion, a senior Indonesian commentator and policymaker talking about COVID and the challenges of transitioning said, quite frankly, we needed real help, and the US wasn't there. Actually, Australia wasn't there. 90% of the PPE in Indonesia has been provided by China. This is a whole different reality. I think the reason for mapping that really quickly is that irrespective of the final outcome of the election, and as Simon said, it's becoming increasingly clear, the US is going to face a harder road in the region, in our immediate region, made harder by the policies of the last administration. And what that means is that it's actually quite a tough environment for Australia going forward. Australia's key interests, and this is obviously a touchstone in our foreign policy, are best served by a peaceful, stable, and prosperous Indo-Pacific, but actually also one in which we can step up and hold on to Australian values. That's quite an important point. But that's going to be very, very difficult if the US can't find an accommodation with China of some sort as an emerging power. Equally, Australia's interests would not be well served if that level of competition or even confrontation continues or is entrenched. And entrenched is really important. As a middle power, and I think, Simon, you touched on this briefly, Australia's also not going to be very well served if there's a further erosion of multilateralism, regionalism, and what we sort of call rules-based order. Because when you're a middle power, like Australia, we can't just command. We actually need these coalitions. We need the rules to sort of protect us. So to the extent that there's going to be a shift in that area, it's quite important in terms of the way that we can pursue our fundamental interests. And look, I'm going to be quick while it's a significant generalization that things won't move fast. We could expect in the outside chance, if there were a Trump administration, there's going to be large continuity. And the continuity in a sentence is more unpredictability, an America first approach, focus on the bilateral, the personal, and pretty much a zero-sum approach. For Biden administration, I think, as the earlier speakers have said, we might see an American foreign policy just a little bit more traditional, with more emphasis on alliances and friendships and a less abrasive internationalist approach, and maybe an effort to actually restore some of the confidence. And that goes back to my first point, the confidence in America's global leadership in the Asia-Pacific. On the US-China relationship, I am strongly in agreement with the earlier speakers that this is the defining relationship. Just to remind everyone, as you're reading the front page of a newspaper today, that currently there's $5 to $6 billion worth of Australian commodity trade at risk with China. China is, we always say it's Australia's largest trading partner, and it's driven economic prosperity. It's important to think of it like this. China accounts for close to 30% of Australia's, we'll just call it bilateral trade. Our next biggest trade partner, Japan, sits at 10%, and the US comes after that. So we're not talking just about an important relationship. We're talking about a dominant relationship with an enormous bearing on our economy. And I'm not saying anything that others have. Quite frankly, our relationship and the level of tension is at an extremely difficult point, and some have characterised it as in the deep freeze. It would be naive to suggest, as the others have noted, that the whole Washington-Beijing tensions are simply going to vanish under a Biden presidency. It's quite clear that the level of bipartisanship and the range of tensions driving Sino-US difficulties so broad that they're going to persist for the immediate future. And as others have said, the US is not, no matter which administration comes forward, going to be able to step back very easily from concerns over unfair trade practices, cyber, IP, activity in the South China Sea, concerns over Hong Kong. However, what we might see, and hopefully a reordering of China policy is going to be a high priority for the Biden administration. We might see a de-escalation in the rhetoric. And that really can't be underestimated. It's quite significant that through the China Daily, the Chinese government in the last day has actually itself said the election is quite an important opportunity for a reset in the relationship. That's exactly the sort of de-escalation that is going to provide the room for a bit of a reset. You're unlikely to see the same sort of, America First mindset, but you're not going to get tariffs going away, as the other said. You might actually see those scope for more multilateral collaboration between the US and China on issues that matter to both of them. And that is actually going to provide a fantastic opportunity for Australia to be able to consider how we might reset also, and how we might actually begin to think about stepping into some of those sorts of new collaborations as a way of reducing tensions. Lastly, as I think Simon has noted already, the focus we might see in a Biden administration on multilateralism and a return to rules is going to be a significant opportunity for Australia. The one area and big watch point for Australia, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A, is of course the environment and Biden's very clear declaration that the US wants to move back into the Paris Agreement. It's actually quite important to put that in our Indo-Pacific context. Just in the last month, we've seen major statements from Japan. We know that China is forward-leaning, also Korea. There are other majors in the region really committed to seeing more action on climate change. So with a move in the US administration, that actually suggests that Australia has got to have a really close think about what we're going to do on climate action, and particularly about the future of our energy exports into the region and our coal sector. So I'm just going to stop it there and say thank you.
Wow, thanks very much, Penny. Also, thanks to Paul and Simon, a really interesting conversation. I'm going to follow up in a moment with a question around China, because all of you spoke about China. But before we move on to the panel discussion, I'd like to remind our large audience, actually, that you can put forward your own questions to the panel at any time, and you can access, again, the Q&A portal available via the link below the video on your screen, or you can enter in your question by going to ceda.pigeonhole.at and using the passcode US election, one word. And you can also vote. If you go into Pigeonhole, you can vote for, you can like the question so we know which ones to pick up. So, okay, so before we go on to the audience questions, I have a question for all of you, and it's around the US-China relationship. And I think I'll go back to Simon for starters, but I'd like all of you to comment. Simon, you said we don't expect a lot of change in the positioning, but you did think there would be change in the way the policies were framed. Could you explain a little bit more detail what we might expect to see? Because as Penny mentioned, a lot is riding on this for us, Australia.
Sure. Okay, so what stays the same? Let's start with that, perhaps. And Paul touched on the domains of concern for the United States. forced technology transfer, protecting American R&D made at home from foreign interference and commercial intellectual espionage, perhaps putting up more walls to Chinese students coming into American postgraduate programs, further steps on sort of decoupling in technology and data security as well. I think all of that, it's hard to find voices around the Biden foreign policy team that wouldn't disagree. I think it's really important for Australians to understand that do not equate the tone and policy in some measures with respect to China as being Trump-specific. There has been a sea change, and it is widely embraced as sort of the mission for the American strategic affairs community, that they are not going to hand over the balance of the 21st century through an authoritarian one-party regime. It has an ideological component to it, a challenge of our age sort of quality to it. So what might change? Global progress on climate change can't go anywhere without China at the table, and Biden and his team know that. What can they get cooperation with China on, and can it be a start towards a sort of what was hoped for China, the engagement, responsible stakeholder sort of model, and is climate perhaps the way they can start to stand up things together, but the other one, I think, on prosecuting the grievances and the case, be it from straight up more conventional national security stuff, South China Sea, ensuring the security of Taiwan, sort of countering sort of incursions and sort of cat and mouse games in the Western Pacific. Australia, on the defence side, has been. I don't think the US has been ignoring the region at all. Actually, on the national security defence side, it's all the other things that Penny talked about, and I think people around Biden understand the US has to come back to the region, not just in things painted battleship grey. And port visits to Vietnam are great, and all of that, and regular freedom of navigation of operations with Australia and Japan, and getting the Quad going. I think what is going to happen away from the security space in civil society, in infrastructure, and indeed in climate change, that works. And I think the Biden team are completely down for that is going to be federated among like-minded allies and partners, and Australia has a really key role to play. And just to echo what Penny said, sort of the way we think about it, Australia and the US bilateral, it's fine. That's not the issue. Australia's national interests are really impacted through the nature of US engagement in the region, and sort of our relationship with the US is sort of regionalized now. We want it to work, and this is sort of behind the scenes at the ministerial level in Osmond's. We need the US-Australia, the alliance that has largely been a military-to-military thing, to be not something that finds footing in the Middle East, but finds footing here in the Indo-Pacific, closer to home, and moreover is a springboard to deeper US engagement in Southeast Asia, in the Pacific Islands, and blossoming out of the defense channel into all these other things, some of which are actually happening. Baby steps like the PNG electrification project. We would like the US to help more in Pacific Step Up. I think their attention is probably going to go to Southeast Asia. But Australia's national interests are very much in those things. And America First, you don't get too much of that. I think a sense of multilateralism, this is what alliances help us do. It's sort of Europe Mark II, might be sort of that, except we don't have the institutional grounding that the transatlantic alliance does in NATO. So it's a little bit more haphazard. And for that reason, Australia has a role to play, as Penny alluded to, that is consistent with our national interests, sort of, and what I put under alliance evolution, regionalizing it and spreading the domains in which it operates. So that's a long answer, but sort of fleshes out at least where we at the US Study Center we devote a lot of our bandwidth to this very question, and so sort of got quite a few thoughts about it.
Okay, thanks very much, Simon. Paul, do you have a view from an economic perspective? What will Will there be change in the way the US-China relationship proceeds? Will there be the same level of tension? And what changes would you expect if it were a Biden presidency?
Yeah, right. As we talked about earlier, I don't think the objectives are all that different. The concerns around, technology, data, health security, reciprocity, etc. I think the tactics or the approach would be different. Just to give you one example, I think what we call the weaponization of trade will probably be much less on the Biden administration. My personal view is that the trade war didn't really achieve its aims. China's imports of U.S. products are running way below the agreed amount. I know that's been impacted by COVID, but focusing the attention again, getting back to this issue of the small disagreement rather than disagreeing on everything. If it's data, technology and health security, and then everything else can kind of continue to function. That's the narrow, in my view, the good interpretation. We're going to have some duplication globally, but I think those are legitimate national security issues. One thing we haven't talked about yet is China's response. And I just wanted to take 30 seconds to talk about dual circulation, because this idea, which started out as made in China 2025 and then dual circulation, this idea that China is going to be self-sufficient on technology, that's a policy choice, but that means slower Chinese growth over the next decade. Because if you think about what's going to make China grow between 2020 and 2030 and beyond, it's not the labor force, because the labor force is now shrinking. It's not going to be capital accumulation, because China's well advanced on that front. It's going to be productivity. So it's engaging with the rest of the world in the tech space and other space, continuing to engage, import not just processes, but ideas, semiconductors, all that stuff. And if China takes a path where that's, made domestically rather than acquired, from the rest of the world, that means slower Chinese growth over the next decade. And this is a country contract with its people is, we deliver the growth and you guys, you be happy and prosper, right? And if we take growth down a couple of notches from, 6.5, which is where we were a couple of years ago, to say 4.5 over the next decade, that's a big movement of the needle. And the point is there, the self-sufficiency in technology that China is now going after is not going to be costless from an economic and probably a political economy point of view. So that'll be something to monitor over the next decade, because that's a China decision, and they're going to have to live with that, because that has clear consequences.
Okay, thanks very much, Paul. Penny, what do we need to see in whatever, whether it's Biden or Trump, what do we need to see in the America-China relationship in order to maximise, our potential in the region?
Thank you. That's a great question. And the others have actually already called out a lot of those points, but I think for Australia to be able to sort of pursue its national interests, what we probably need to see on both sides in the US-China relationship is, quite frankly, to start with, just a commitment to getting things back on a slightly more even keel and de-escalating, and to pick up on Paul's point, a sort of recommitment to dealing with problems or challenges in the relationship in a much more narrowly defined way, instead of this, we are strategic competitors, everything is a problem, where there are actually specific concerns and issues, whether that be in the digital space or in tech, whether it's on the trade front, actually committing to address the issues one by one in a way that, and this is really, I hate to sound like a broken record, but the really important point for Australia, to address those issues in a way that actually respects the rules, reinforces multilateralism, rather than simply, the giants cutting deals that ultimately are not going to be good for us. One of the things we don't often talk about in Australia is, the US-China trade deals, quite frankly, could have had huge implications for Australia's exports to China of commodities. And it's not kind of cricket to say that publicly, but cutting deals between cricket, is that American football to say that? It's actually not something we've aired publicly, because suggesting that the Americans cutting deals is going to hurt us, it's not part of the political lexicon currently. But on both sides, a return to respecting the institutions that are there to deal with the problems. And in trade, it's, for example, the WTO, and using the mechanisms that exist. And that's not just the US, it's China has to do it too, quite frankly. Second thing is where there need to be new rules of the road, and the whole digital and tech sector where we lack any global trade rules is, first cab off the rank from where I sit, followed narrowly by health and health security, committing on both sides that they will work on multilateral solutions and bringing others in so that we can develop new rules of the road, new norms and new ways of collaboration that protect the interests of countries like Australia. Just stop there.
Yeah, thanks very much, Penny. Quite challenging when there's kind of a move to self-sufficiency and at the moment in response to COVID, but also we talk about the policy in China, etc. I'll just move on to the audience questions, if that's okay. And one that's trending quite highly at the moment is, to what degree will Australia, and I'll put it to you first, Penny, to what degree will Australia's political playbook be influenced by trends and behaviours we're seeing in the US?
That's a tough one. I think it's very important to note that, Australian politicians and our current Prime Minister included are very clear, actually, that their playbook and the playbook they follow is what they feel is best going to serve Australia's national interests. And that ultimately we in Australia and the government will determine how best it feels it can serve those interests. If it sees in someone else's playbook something that is valuable, obviously we're going to, to look to that. If in others' playbooks we see the kind of behaviours and policies that won't serve our interests, we're not going to be, quite frankly, blindly following that. So I do think, however, that a change in US administration and a different approach, particularly in the region, will create more space for us to shift some of the ways that we might be engaging with our neighbours.
Okay, thank you. There's another curly question, and it's to do with a comment that several of you made, and it was again around self-sufficiency. And I don't know who asked the question, but I'll ask this to Paul actually first. Is greater self-sufficiency and less reliance on key partners unavoidable for Australia? And yeah, so unavoidable. Is it unavoidable? Is it the way the world is going? We're talking on the one hand about we'd really like to see, the US moving to support multilateral institutions, but you've got this contradictory kind of setting that's going on in the world in response to COVID, I presume.
Yeah, well, first of all, I worked for the IMF for a very long time, so that makes me a committed internationalist, I guess. So, and we've spoken a bit, I think Penny just said this a few minutes ago, about, it's moved from a world where you had a platform based on rules and, reciprocity, and everyone played by those rules, and you had arbitration and the global institutions mattered. We've gone from that very quickly to size matters, right? And if you're American, that's fine because we're a big country, but if you're a mid-sized power like Australia, that's quite a different question. So, putting back my old hat, I would love to go back toward a world where the platform was based on markets and trade and, openness, and everyone could benefit. Hopefully we're moving in that direction. We'll have to wait and see. I think for a country like Australia, trade's just unavoidable. And I think, Australia's success has been its openness and its reforms, starting back from the Keating government. I guess it's been a couple of decades now, and Australia had its first recession in 3 decades because of COVID. So the track record's amazing, but that was a combination of structural reforms and then openness. We've got a lot of countries in different parts of the world that are commodity exporters, and they're wishing that, they weren't commodity exporters, because you can never be a successful country if you're a commodity exporter. But my two answers to that question are Australia and Canada, which are both big countries. They have strong institutions, but they're essentially commodity exporters, and they're very prosperous. So I think, as an American at an Australian event, I think openness and reform and, have served Australia well. So if that's got to be part of the path going forward, whether it's the post-World War II Bretton Woods path or it's something a little bit different, I think that particular path as a superior one is very clear in my view.
Okay, thank you. Last question to you, Simon, and it's to do with the way of voting in the US. So is it time? This is a question from David Harrison. Is it time to do away with the Electoral College system?
Probably, but it ain't going to happen. There is a movement afoot that has been afoot since the year dot, that each state allocate its electors in proportion with the national vote, the so-called popular vote, or just give it all to the winner of the popular vote nationally. That's a few states sign up to that, but if you're a small state, why would you ever give away the power that you have? And I used to joke there's only one thing better than being elected president of the United States, and that's owning an Ohio television station. The attention that gets lavished on those flyover states, as they're sometimes called, means that I don't think that system is going away anytime soon. There might be, it'll stay debated, but I think we are stuck with these institutions in American government that opened up with the Electoral College and the fact that each state gets two senators that are quite on their face prone to being anti-majoritarian from time to time, depending on the way the partisan distribution maps onto these things we call state boundaries. And I think it's just a fact of life for the time being. It's like asking Tasmania to give up the fact that it has 12 senators and a minimum of five House of Rep seats. That's hardwired into the Australian Constitution. Now, it hasn't posed a massive issue yet. And moreover, I'd also point out for Australian listeners, we've had two elections in our recent history, 1990 and 1998, where by tiny margins, the person winning the party winning the most two-party preferred vote did not form government. So John Howard got fewer votes than Kim Beazley on a two-party preferred basis, or the coalition got fewer votes than Labor, 2PP, in 1998, the so-called GST election, and Labor won the marginal seat battle in 1990. And got over the line despite being outpolled. So it happens every now and then in Australian elections. It happened to the South Australian Liberal Party forever, up until quite recently. They finally won government, despite for quite a few elections in a row having won a majority of the votes statewide. So it's not just the United States. It's pretty spectacular in the United States. But this is baked into almost to any system that is so-called a two-stage electoral mechanism. First, you vote into districts, and then the sort of a winner-take-all rule by district, and then they go into a legislature to then make majority rule decisions. You're always going to have these sorts of possibilities in play.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. It's not going to change soon. That brings our questions to a close. We're almost on time. So I'd like to thank Professor Simon Jackman. I'd like to thank Paul Gruenwald and Penny Burtt for their great commentary and their insights. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you in the audience for your participation and for your questions, and remind you all that this event is being recorded and will soon make the recording available on the CEDA website so that you can rewatch if you like and share with your colleagues and network. And viewers, you can post additional questions to Pigeonhole for the next 15 minutes, and CEDA will post selected responses in their post-event email. So please also continue the conversation by connecting with CEDA via LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube and Facebook, and by visiting www.ceda.com.au. As you know, the US election is not over yet, so keep watching. And thank you all for joining today, and I look forward to continuing the conversation in the future. Thank you, everyone.